The men from the land office arrived on a Thursday morning in late September, when the sky over the Dakota Territory had turned the color of an old bruise and the grass along the ridge had gone the pale gold of things that have given up on growing. They rode in from the east, two of them, their horses picking careful steps along the rutted track that served as a road through this part of the territory. The taller one, Stellan Voss, sat his horse the way a man sat who had spent his life being the largest presence in any room he entered. His shoulders were broad under his wool coat, and his beard was the iron gray of a man who had decided somewhere around 40 that certainty was more valuable than doubt and had not revisited the question since. He was the settlement's master builder, the man who had put up more structures in this part of Dakota than anyone else, and he carried that fact the way other men carried weapons, as something that gave him the right to judge what was standing and what was not. The other man was Aldous Crane, the land agent, a creature of paper and authority who seemed most at home when both were in his hands simultaneously. He rode with the careful posture of a man who had spent his life trying to look taller than he was, his collar starched to a rigidity that suggested his soul had received the same treatment. He carried a clipboard against his chest like a shield, and on the clipboard was a form with a line near the bottom that he had not yet filled in, though his pen was ready. They came over the slight rise and stopped, and for a moment they simply looked at what lay before them. The claim was 160 acres of Dakota prairie, the kind of land that looked like promise in the spring pamphlets the railroads distributed in the eastern cities and looked like something else entirely by October. The grass was short and wind-scoured. The sky above it was enormous in the way that Dakota skies were enormous, not magnificent, but simply vast, a fact about the world that had no particular interest in the people living under it. What the men saw was this: a small cabin, its log walls chinked with a mixture of mud and grass, its roof of wooden shingles already showing the dark patches of moisture penetration that meant the coming winter would find its way inside before the first month was out. A thread of smoke rose from the chimney, but it was thin, barely thicker than a thread of yarn, which meant the fire inside was small. Beside the cabin, a stack of firewood that was a fraction of what the winter would demand. A lean-to shed with a single thin cow that regarded the horizon with the philosophical blankness of an animal that has accepted its circumstances. And the whole, it was what the eye went to first once you had taken in the inadequacy of everything else. A great raw rectangle cut into the earth, perhaps 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, with walls of dark soil dropping away into shadow. Beside it, a mound of excavated earth rose like something a gravedigger would pile beside an open plot, and the comparison was not accidental. The whole looked exactly like what it looked like. There was no other way to see it. Stellan Voss looked at it for a long moment. Then he made a sound low in his throat, a sound that contained his verdict in full before he had spoken a word. The breath that came out of him was white in the cold air, a small cloud of contemptuous certainty. "She's digging her own grave," he said. He said it at a volume designed to carry, not shouting, nothing so crude as that, but pitched with the expertise of a man who understood acoustics, who built things and therefore understood how sound moved through space, who knew that words spoken at this particular volume on this particular morning would reach all the way down the slope to the cabin below and the figure moving near the excavation. Aldous Crane looked at his clipboard. He made a small, precise mark on the paper. The sound of the pen was the sound of a conclusion being recorded. The year was 1887, and the territory of Dakota was in the middle of a fever that would in time be diagnosed as the particular madness of optimism colliding with geography. The government and the railroads had been papering the country for years with promises: fertile land, gentle seasons, opportunity, waiting in the prairie soil for any man willing to stake a claim. The Homestead Act had opened the floodgates, and through those gates had come waves of settlers, German and Norwegian and Irish, and a dozen other kinds, all of them carrying the same brochure in their heads, the one that showed golden wheat under a benevolent sun. The previous winter had been a liar. Mild and forgiving, it had encouraged exactly the kind of recklessness that a hard winter punishes. Settlers had built thin-walled cabins and told each other that the pamphlets were right. Stellan Voss had sold them his best iron stoves and told them they were warm enough. The whole settlement had looked at one easy winter and decided it was the norm, the way people always decided that their recent experience was the rule rather than the exception. Marin Elwyn knew it was the exception. She was 19 years old, and Orphanhood was a condition she had inhabited since the spring, when the fever had come through the territory with the quiet efficiency of something that had no particular grievance and no particular mercy. Her parents, Piotr and Bozena Elwin, had died within 3 days of each other in April, when the thaw was still new and the ground was just soft enough to dig. They had come from the Carpathian Highlands, a region of mountains so old and so cold that the people who lived there had developed over generations a relationship with winter that their neighbors in the Dakota settlement had no equivalent for. In the Carpathians, winter was not a season to be endured until spring arrived to rescue you. Winter was a sentient force, something that had intentions and methods, something that rewarded preparation and punished arrogance with an even-handedness that bordered on the philosophical. The people of that region had learned to read winter the way sailors read water, not as something to conquer, but as something to understand. Piotr and Bozena had brought this knowledge with them across the ocean, and their neighbors in the settlement had taken it for what people always take such things for when they come from somewhere foreign, an old superstition. Peasant belief, the kind of thinking that educated people in a modern country had moved beyond. Marin had grown up watching her father read the land and her mother read the sky, and she had learned both languages. She saw the muskrats in August building their lodges in the creek with walls twice as thick as she had ever seen them build before. The animals knew things their bodies registered before their minds could name, and they were preparing for something that the current mild air gave no indication of. She saw the squirrels working with a desperation that went beyond the ordinary urgency of autumn. They were not gathering for the winter the way squirrels gathered when the winter ahead was ordinary. They were hoarding against something catastrophic, their small bodies moving back and forth across the prairie with the focused terror of creatures who understood exactly what was coming. She saw the geese leaving 3 weeks earlier than they had left the previous year, and she watched their formations move south across the sky, and she counted the days they were ahead of schedule, and the number was not reassuring. She saw a group of Lakota pass through the territory on their way to the reservation, and one of the elders, a man whose face held the particular weathering of someone who had spent his entire life reading the language the land spoke, had looked at the settlement's cabins with an expression that contained no judgment, only a kind of sorrowful recognition. He had said something in his own language to the young man who served as interpreter, and the young man had looked uncomfortable in the way that interpreters looked uncomfortable when the truth they were translating was one the listeners would not want to hear. What he said the young man had offered translating carefully. The word is difficult. It means something like sorrow. Sorrow for what is coming. Marin had felt that sorrow in her own bones. She had done the accounting of her situation with the unsentimental clarity of someone who has no margin for self-deception. Her father's log stack was barely a third of what it should have been by October. The fever had taken him before the real cutting season. The cabin walls were thin, the chinking adequate for a mild winter and inadequate for a hard one. Her resources were what they were: a half-empty sack of flour, a barrel of salted pork, several jars of the beets her mother had pickled in late summer, one thin cow, and a parcel of land that the men from the land office would take away from her if she could not demonstrate improvement before the spring thaw. According to every measure that Stellenbosch and Aldous Crane applied to the world, her fate was already settled. The lamb was tethered. The wolf was coming. The only question was timing. Marin met them at the door of the cabin. She had seen them coming from half a mile out, and she had set down the pickaxe and walked to the cabin and washed her hands in the bucket by the door, not because she expected the visit to go well, but because her mother had taught her that you met difficulty on your feet and with clean hands. She stood in the doorway, and she did not invite them in. The spade was in her left hand, its handle smooth and dark with the work of years. Her father's grip absorbed into the wood so thoroughly that she could feel him when she held it. She held it loosely, naturally, not as a weapon, simply as the thing she had been holding before they came and intended to hold again when they left. Stellenbosch looked her over with the practiced eye of a man who assessed structures for a living. He took in her height, which was not considerable. He took in her wool dress, practical and worn. He took in the set of her jaw, and he filed this away somewhere in the category of things that were going to make this conversation more tedious than it needed to be. He did not look at the spade because the spade was beneath his notice. Miss Elwin, Aldous Crane began. His voice had the quality of something that had been prepared in advance and rehearsed for tone. He had done this many times, delivered notices to women alone on claims that were failing, and he had developed a particular cadence for it. Sympathetic but unambiguous, the voice of a system explaining why its workings were not personal. We've come to assess the viability of your claim. I see, said Marin. Her voice was low and carried no tremor. She had been crying on and off since April. She was not going to cry now. Voss's gaze had moved past her to the hole. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he had already categorized and did not intend to reconsider. He gestured toward it with his chin, a motion that managed to convey both dismissal and something that fell just short of contempt. What is this folly? It was not a question. He phrased it as a statement because he was not genuinely curious about the answer. He already knew the answer. It was the foolish project of a girl who was out of her depth and digging quite literally in the wrong direction. It is my business, said Marin. She said it simply without heat. It is my business was both a fact and a boundary, and she meant it as both. It becomes my business, Crane interjected, when it indicates an inability to improve the claim as required by the Homestead Act. He held the clipboard slightly forward as one held evidence. The law requires a habitable dwelling and cultivation. What you have here. He let the disdain complete the sentence. His eyes moved from the thin smoke of the cabin chimney to the excavation mound, to the inadequate woodpile, to the thin cow in the lean-to, and what he assembled from these observations was a picture of failure so comprehensive that it barely required comment. He held out the clipboard with the form attached to it. This is a formal notice of potential forfeiture, he said. You have until the spring thaw. If at that time this claim is not deemed viable and productive, it will be reverted to the land office and reassigned. He said he was sorry. The way he said it made clear that sorry was a word he used in the way that printers use boilerplate, as a standard element that appeared in a fixed position regardless of the specific content surrounding it. Stellenvoss stepped forward. When he moved, something shifted in his expression, the bureaucratic flatness giving way to something that thought of itself as concern and was in fact something much more complicated. He had a face that knew how to arrange itself into the appearance of wisdom, the heavy brow and the iron beard, and the deep-set eyes combining into something that looked to most people who encountered it like the face of someone who had earned the right to judge. Listen, he said. His voice dropped to the register men used when they wanted to sound like they were doing you a favor. There's no shame in admitting defeat. This is a hard land. It broke your father. He said the last sentence without apparent awareness of what it was doing, the way people said the cruelest things in the world as simple fact as evidence, as something so obviously true that noticing its effect on the listener would not have occurred to them. It'll break you, he continued. I'll make you an offer, your father's tools. The anvil, the good saws, the brace, and bit. They're of no use to you now. I'll give you $20 for the lot and passage on the next train east back to whatever family you have. $20. Marin knew what her father's tools were worth. She had watched him use them for as long as she could remember, watched his hands on the saw handles and the hammer grips, watched the way he moved through work with the ease of someone who understood his instruments so completely that the understanding had become part of his body. The tools were worth 5 times $20 at a minimum. They were also worth everything that attached to them, which had no monetary value at all, but which she was not going to explain to Stellenvoss. No, she said. The word landed between them. Voss's face shifted again, the concern dropping away like a coat being shrugged off. What was underneath was harder and more honest. He was a man who was accustomed to being right, and people who were accustomed to being right had a particular response to being refused, a tightening, a cooling, a withdrawal of whatever warmth they had offered along with the offer. Suit yourself, he said, but don't come begging when the first blizzard hits. We'll have our own to look after. A community can't carry the dead weight of the unprepared. He turned and walked away. Aldous Crane gave her a nod that contained everything his form of sympathy could manage, which was not much, and followed Voss back up the slope toward their horses. They left her standing at the door of her cabin with the forfeiture notice in her hand and the cold air moving against her face and the sound of their horses receding up the track. And she stood there until the sound was gone, and there was nothing but wind and the thin lowing of her cow and the vast indifferent sky above the Dakota prairie. She looked at the notice. The paper was crisp and white and precise, the printing neat, the language official. Potential forfeiture. Spring thaw deadline. The words had the finality of a sentence delivered by someone with the authority to deliver sentences. Then she looked at the hole. It was 6 feet deep. She could see the change in the soil at the different levels, the darker topsoil giving way to the lighter, denser clay below. She had been digging for 3 weeks, working from before dawn until the light failed, and what she had produced was a hole 6 feet deep and 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. It was not enough. She knew this in the way she knew the other things she knew, not from education, but from memory, from the half-remembered conversations of her childhood, from the things her parents had said to each other across the kitchen table, of the soddy they had built in their first years on the claim before her father had earned enough to put up the cabin. She had been reaching towards something without knowing exactly what she was reaching toward, acting on an instinct that she could not yet name. The naming would come that night. She went inside. The cabin was one-room log walls and plank floor, and a ceiling low enough that she could touch it if she stretched. The iron stove in the corner, Voss's best model, the one he had sold her father with the assurance that it would keep a family warm through anything the territory could produce. She built the fire carefully, feeding it small pieces first, watching the flame establish itself before adding the larger wood. Wood was not something she could afford to waste. She made a meal of what she had, which was not much salted pork and the last of a heel of bread, and she ate at the table by the window, watching the light fail over the prairie and the first stars appear above the horizon. On the table was the forfeiture notice. She looked at it while she ate. Then she looked at the wall, and the wall looked back at her with its log faces and its chinking and its inadequate insulation, and she thought about the coming winter, about what the animals were telling her, and what the Lakota elder had said, and what the geese had known when they left early. She thought about $20 in a train ticket east. To what? To a life of service in someone else's house in some crowded city, a life with no land and no name, and no connection to anything her parents had bled to build. A life in which everything they had sacrificed would simply stop mattering, would be absorbed into the indifferent machinery of a world that had no particular use for the dreams of people who had died trying. No, the word came up from somewhere below, thought from the same place the stubbornness came from the same place all the things that kept her alive came from. It was not a decision. It was a refusal. And refusing was something she had learned before she could name. In watching her father refuse the things that tried to diminish him, and watching her mother refuse the things that tried to diminish her, and understanding that the refusing was itself a form of building, that what you held against the world was its own kind of structure. She rose from the table and went to the large wooden trunk at the foot of her parents' bed. The bed was still made up the way her mother had left it, the quilt folded down, the pillow centered. Marin had not been able to change this. The trunk smelled of cedar and the dried lavender her mother had packed between the linens, and underneath those smells, very faint, the smell of her mother herself, a smell that had no name, but that Marin recognized in the way you recognize the things that predated language, before you had the words for what you felt. She had known the trunk all her life. She had helped her mother pack it when they prepared to leave the Carpathians, and she had helped her mother unpack it when they arrived. She knew every item in it by touch and smell, the embroidered blouses and the linen tablecloths and the small wooden icons wrapped carefully in cloth, the photographs and the letters and the objects whose meanings she had never needed to ask about because some meanings did not require words. She went through these layers, carefully setting them aside with the same care her mother had used to fold them. And at the bottom, beneath everything, she found what she had not known she was looking for. It was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a length of cord that had been knotted and reknotted over what looked like many years, the cord darkened with handling, and the knots worn smooth with repeated tying and untying. She had seen it before as a child, had reached for it once, with the natural curiosity of a child for anything mysterious in a parent's possession, and her mother had gently moved her hand away. For a time of great need, her mother had said. In the old language, the phrase had a weight to it that translated imperfectly. It meant not simply a time when you needed something, but a time when the need itself defined the moment, a threshold, a turning point, a before and an after. Marin looked at the bundle in her lap. Her fingers were stiff with cold, and with the weeks of work in the excavation, the joints swollen slightly at the knuckles, the skin cracked at the fingertips, where the dry autumn air had found the seams. She worked at the knots. They took time. When the last one gave way, she folded back the oilcloth. Inside was a book, It was a journal bound in leather that had aged to a deep brown, the surface cracked in patterns that reminded her of the bottom of a dried creek bed. The cover was embossed with a pattern she did not recognize, a swirling design that might have been stylized vines, or perhaps something more abstract, something meant to suggest movement or growth. The leather had the solidity of something that had been made to last, made by someone who intended it to survive them. She opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting in an ink that had faded from black to a deep reddish brown, the color of old blood, and the script was one she could read only imperfectly, the Carpathian dialect of her grandparents' generation, its letters familiar in shape, but combined in ways that outpaced her ability to follow. But alongside the script on nearly every other page was something she recognized immediately and completely: her mother's handwriting. The careful, deliberate block letters that Bozina Elwyn had used when she wanted to be certain of clarity, the handwriting of a woman who had learned written language as an adult and approached it with the earnest precision of someone for whom writing was still an act requiring full attention. Her mother had translated the journal. Not all of it, not continuously, but in the margins and on facing pages and in the spaces that the original writer had left her. Mother had spent years rendering the old woman's words into a language her daughter could read. And more than just the words, she had copied out the diagrams, redrawing them in her own hand, with careful labels, adding notes and clarifications in the margins, turning the original document into something that a girl who had grown up between two languages could use. Marin carried the book to the table and positioned the candle so that its light fell directly on the pages, and she began to read. The journal had been written by a woman named Sophie, her mother's mother, a grandmother she had never met, and knew only from the stories her mother had told. In those stories, Sophie had been a figure of considerable legend, a woman who had, by family account, performed agricultural feats in the Carpathian highlands that her neighbors had found inexplicable, coaxing life from soil that should have been dead, growing things in conditions that should have prevented growth. The neighbors had called it many things over the years, but Sophie's family had known what it actually was, which was knowledge. Hard-won, carefully accumulated, painstakingly recorded knowledge. She read. The first diagrams she encountered were cross-sections of the earth drawn with surprising technical precision for a woman who had presumably had no formal training. They showed structures built into the ground, dug down rather than built up, their relationship to the surface indicated by dotted lines representing the frost line, the depth to which winter cold could penetrate the soil. The labels in her mother's hand explained below the frost line the earth maintains a constant temperature regardless of surface conditions. In this region, in these mountains, the stable temperature is approximately equal to the annual average air temperature, not warm by any summer measure, but above freezing, reliably, consistently, perpetually above freezing. Marin looked up from the page. She thought about the hole she had been digging, 6 feet deep. She had been acting on something she could not name, a half-remembered fragment from her parents' conversations, a sense that the answer to the winter was in the earth rather than above it. She had been right in a direction and wrong in degree. 6 feet was not enough. The frost line in this territory went deeper. The journal specified at minimum 10 feet, preferably 12. Below 12 feet, the earth would hold its steady warmth through any winter the surface could produce. She turned the page. The next principle the journal addressed was what Sophie called the generosity of the sun. Even the winter sun, low in its arc across the sky, was a source of energy so vast that a person who knew how to receive it properly could use it to grow food in temperatures that would otherwise make growing impossible. The key was the angle of reception. A roof surface angled correctly to face the winter sun's low path through the sky would intercept that light with far greater efficiency than a vertical wall or a horizontal surface. The journal specified the angle 45 degrees oriented due south. This was not a guess or a preference. It was a calculation arrived at through years of observation and adjustment, refined by the particular unforgiving honesty of results. The roof was to be made of glass. Marin sat with this for a moment. Glass was not something she had. Glass was not something she could easily acquire. Glass in the Dakota Territory in 1887 was a commodity, and commodities required money. And money was precisely what she did not have. She kept reading. The journal addressed the next principle with what Marin was beginning to recognize as Sophie's characteristic method, stating the problem, identifying the resource that solved it, and then explaining the mechanism by which the solution worked. Sophie had been, by all evidence, a woman who thought in systems, who looked at the world and saw relationships between things rather than the things themselves. Thermal mass, her mother's translation read. The problem with capturing the sun's heat is that heat captured in air is heat that will escape again when the sun is gone. Air has no memory. The solution is to capture the heat in something that does have memory, something dense and slow, something that will absorb the warmth during the hours of light and release it back gradually through the hours of darkness. The drawing showed stone, walls of stone lining the subterranean structure, acting as the battery for the solar energy that the glass roof would collect, and inside the structure barrels of water. Water, Sophie had written in a sentence that her mother had underlined twice, is a miracle of thermal capacity. It holds more heat per unit of volume than almost any other common substance. A barrel of water warmed by the day's sun will release that warmth into the surrounding air all through the night. Marin read the sentence twice. Then she sat back and looked at the candle flame, and she thought about the 4 large wooden barrels that were currently sitting empty in the lean-to, where her father had stored them, intending to use them for something he had not gotten to before the fever came. She thought about the creek half a mile away, still running under a skin of ice at this time of year, still carrying water. She thought about the stones in the creek bed, and along its banks the flat stones her father had said were good building stones, the stones she had seen him turn over with his boot in a habitual gesture of assessment. She thought about the excavation outside the hole 6 feet deep that she had been digging without knowing exactly why, acting on something that was half memory and half instinct and had now finally been given its proper name and its proper dimensions and its proper instructions. She turned page after page, reading through the diagrams of ventilation and drainage, reading the notes on which plants grew best in the cool, stable temperatures of the subterranean space, reading the records Sophie had kept over decades of seasons in the Carpathian Highlands, the harvest weights and the temperature readings and the adjustments made year by year as understanding deepened and the system improved. Her grandmother had grown tomatoes in January. She had grown lettuce and spinach and kale and herbs through winters that would have stopped the growth of anything in ordinary soil. She had fed her family and her neighbors from a space she had dug into the earth with her own hands, using physics and patience and the accumulated wisdom of a mind that had spent its whole life paying attention to what the earth was willing to give if you asked it correctly. It was not superstition. It had never been superstition. It was knowledge old and tested and real, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, across an ocean in a generation, preserved in a leather journal that had survived the crossing and the years and the fever and the grief, waiting in the cedar-smelling dark of a wooden trunk for the moment of great need. Marin looked at the forfeiture notice on the table. She looked at the journal in her hands. One of these documents represented the certainty of men who had confused their ignorance for knowledge and their confidence for competence. The other represented a century of genuine understanding, hard-won from one of the most unforgiving landscapes on earth, paid for in labor and cold, and the patient recording of results. She knew which one she was going to trust. She blew out the candle and lay down on her cot without undressing, and she looked at the ceiling of the cabin and listened to the wind moving along the walls and feeling for the gaps in the chinking, and she thought about the angles and the depths and the stone walls that would need to be built, and the barrels that would need to be filled, and the glass that she did not yet have and did not yet know how she would get. The cold pressed in from outside, the particular cold of a Dakota October night that suggested, without quite committing to it, the depth of cold that was coming. Before dawn, she was up. Before the light was sufficient to work by, she was already down in the hole, the pickaxe in her hands, the point of it finding the dense clay with a rhythm that had nothing tentative about it now. Every strike was purposeful. Every movement of dirt from the excavation to the surface was an argument, a construction, a proof being assembled against the certainty of Stellenbosch. She understood now what she was building. She understood why she needed to go deeper than the frost line, and why the stones from the creek bed were not incidental but structural, and why the south-facing slope of the roof was not an aesthetic choice but a physical necessity. She understood the relationship between the sun's winter angle and the glass surface she would need to receive it, and she understood why the water in the barrels was not just water, but a thermal battery, a system for storing the energy of the day against the cold of the night. The knowledge made the work different. It was still brutal. The clay at 10 feet was harder than anything she had encountered in the upper soil, and the stones embedded in it jarred her arms with each strike, and sometimes refused to move at all until she had worked around them from multiple angles, prying and chipping until they surrendered. Her palms tore through their calluses and bled, and then built new calluses over the blood. She wrapped them in strips of cloth, and the cloth wore through, and she wrapped them again. But the knowledge meant she was not simply exhausting herself in the prairie. She was building something. Every foot of depth was a foot below the frost line, a foot of protection against the cold that was coming, a foot of distance between her seedlings and the winter that was going to kill everything above the surface. 6 feet became 8, 8 became 10. Stellan Voss rode by on a Wednesday, his horse picking careful steps along the track road, and he pulled up at the edge of the excavation and looked down at her working 8 feet below the surface. She looked like something she had dug up herself, dirty from her hair to her boots, her breath coming in white puffs in the cold air. Still digging, he called down. His voice had the warmth of a man who considered himself generous with his mockery, who believed he was doing the person receiving it a service by being honest. She did not look up. She did not answer. She swung the pickaxe. The sound of the impact traveled up the walls of the excavation and reached him, and for a moment he seemed uncertain what to do with her silence. Mockery required a response, even if only a flinch, to do the work it was meant to do. Her silence turned it back on him with nowhere to go. He rode away. She swung the pickaxe again. 10 feet became 12. At 12 feet, she stopped digging down and began digging out, extending the floor of the excavation to the full 20 feet she needed, clearing the last of the loose material, smoothing the earthen walls as best she could with the flat of the spade. She stood at the bottom of the completed excavation and looked up at the rectangle of sky above her, the pale October blue framed by the dark walls of earth, and she took a breath of the air at the bottom. It smelled different down here. Not the sharp surface smell of autumn prairie, cold and dry, and carrying the scent of dying grass. This was something older and more fundamental. The smell of earth at depth of minerals and moisture, and the slow, dark processes of things decomposing and transforming over geological time. It was the smell her grandmother had written about, the smell of the earth's interior warmth, subtle but unmistakable. Marin pressed her palm flat against the earth wall. It was cool but not cold. Not the cold of the surface, the cold that was already in October biting at her face and her hands when she climbed out of the excavation at the end of each day. This was something different, steady, constant, exactly what the journal had described. Below the frost line, the earth maintains a constant temperature, not warm by any summer measure, but above freezing, reliably, consistently, perpetually above freezing. She was standing in it. She was standing at the bottom of the structure her grandmother had described and her mother had preserved, and the forfeiture notice had tried to take from her, and the earth around her was already doing exactly what Sophie had written that it would do, holding its quiet warmth against the cold that pressed down from above. Marin stood at the bottom of the hole for a long moment. The sky above her was the pale October blue of a late afternoon, and the wind that moved across it was the beginning of something that would not stop moving until spring. She had 12 feet of excavation completed. She had stone to collect from the creek bed, and mortar to mix and walls to build, and a glass roof to figure out, and barrels to fill, and seeds to plant, and an entirely insufficient amount of money to do any of it. She had a forfeiture notice with a deadline. She had a journal that her grandmother had filled with 40 years of understanding. She put her hands on the earthen walls and began to climb out. There was a great deal more to do. The stones did not come willingly. Nothing in the Dakota Territory came willingly. That was the first lesson the land taught, and it taught it without variation or exception to every person who arrived with the belief that wanting something badly enough was a form of preparation. The land did not negotiate. It did not take into account what you needed or what you had sacrificed to get here or what the pamphlets had promised. It simply was what it was, and what you got from it was precisely what you were willing to pay in full. Marin paid in full. The creek was half a mile from the claim, which meant each trip with the wheelbarrow was a mile of travel over ground that was uneven and increasingly frozen, the ruts and hollows of the track road, trying to catch the wheel and tip the load. She went in the mornings before the temperature dropped back from whatever fragile warmth the midday sun provided, loading the wheelbarrow with the flat stones from the creek bed that her father had always said were good building stones, the ones he had turned over with his boot in the habitual gesture of a man who noticed materials the way other men notice faces. She noticed them differently now. She loaded them with the understanding of what they were going to do, what role they were going to play in the system her grandmother had designed. These were not just stones, they were thermal mass. They were the battery of the structure, the element that would absorb the sun's heat during the hours of light and release it back into the air during the long cold night. The journal had been specific about their qualities: dense, substantial, without significant air pockets. The flat stones from creek beds were ideal. Sophie had used exactly this kind of stone in the Carpathian Highlands, and the record she had kept of the results over decades was the record Maren was working from. She thought about Sophie often in those weeks. Her grandmother had died before Maren was born, and what she knew of her was the legend version, the stories her mother had told in the evenings in the cabin, stories that had the particular quality of family mythology, larger than ordinary life, but anchored to it, rooted in real geography and real cold and real winters that had actually happened. Now working through the journal, she was getting the other version, the version behind the legend, the one that showed not the miraculous outcomes, but the work that had produced them. Sophie had not been born knowing these things. She had learned them the way all real knowledge was learned, by doing and failing, and recording the failure and adjusting and doing again. The journal was full of crossed-out calculations and revised diagrams. Notes written in one season and contradicted in the next, the whole document, a record of a mind in conversation with reality, correcting itself, improving, never satisfied with what it understood, because understanding was always provisional in the face of what the earth could still teach you. Maren found this more useful than the legend. The legend gave you awe. The journal gave you a method. By the end of the second week of hauling stones, she had enough to begin the walls. She mixed her mortar from the creek clay and the dry grass she gathered from the prairie, the same mixture her father had used for the cabin, chinking, a technique that the settlement's newcomers called primitive, and that her parents had known was one of the most effective insulators available in a landscape that offered limited alternatives. She worked the mixture to the right consistency, not too wet and not too dry, and she began laying the stones against the earthen walls of the excavation building, up from the floor, with the flat faces inward, fitting them together with the careful interlocking of a person who understood that the wall she was building had to last through something she could feel coming but could not yet see. The work in the excavation was different from the digging. The digging had been violence in its way, a sustained attack on the earth's resistance, a battle measured in broken stone and burning muscles and the slow accumulation of depth. The wall building was something else. It required attention of a different kind, spatial attention, the three-dimensional problem-solving of fitting irregular pieces together into a coherent whole. Her father had been a man who understood this kind of work, who could look at a pile of stones and see the wall they wanted to become, and she found herself working in ways that felt like memory rather than invention, her hands finding solutions her mind had not consciously formulated. She thought about his hands on the saw grips and the chisel handles and understood in a way she had not understood before that what he had given her was not just the tools but the knowledge of how to use them, absorbed through years of watching, without knowing she was watching, stored in her body alongside everything else. The mockery continued. Stellan Voss made a point of passing by every few days, and he rarely passed by alone. He brought his eldest son, a 16-year-old, who had his father's eyes and his father's confidence, without the substance that Voss had at least partly earned. He brought other men from the settlement, neighboring claimants who had built their cabins with Voss's guidance and who trusted his assessment of what was viable and what was not. They would stop their horses at the edge of the excavation and look down at her, working, and their expressions contained the same mixture she had seen in Voss's face from the beginning: dismissal, pity, and something underneath both of those that was harder to name, something that went to work when a person was confronted with someone who was doing something they did not understand. Still digging to China, Voss would call down, "Find any gold yet?" She did not look up. She did not answer. His son tried once. "My father says you're touched in the head. He says the winter will make this your coffin." She heard the words. They landed as words land, and she felt their weight, the specific cruelty of coffin, delivered by a 16-year-old boy who thought he was repeating wisdom, when he was actually repeating his father's fear in a cruder form. The children who passed on the track road had begun calling it the girl's grave. She had heard this too, had heard a group of them whispering as they passed, the name passing between them, like something they had been told by an adult and were testing the weight of. The girl's grave. One afternoon in the third week of November, she was working at the bottom of the excavation when she stopped. She had been laying the final course of the stone wall along the east face, fitting a particularly stubborn piece into a gap that kept refusing to close cleanly, and she had stopped because something had shifted in the quality of her own silence. Not the silence of concentration, but the silence of a person who has heard something that has reached past the surface defenses and found the place underneath. She put down the stone she was holding. She stood in the bottom of the excavation and looked up at the rectangle of November sky above her, the pale gray of a sky that had been deciding about snow for a week without committing to it. The walls of earth and stone rose around her on all sides. The depth of the excavation meant that the rim was well above her head, that to someone standing at the surface looking in, she would appear as a small figure at the bottom of a very deep hole. She looked at her hands. They were not the hands she had brought to this place. The hands she had brought had been a young woman's hands, still carrying the smoothness of the years before hard work had made its permanent changes. These hands were different. The skin was cracked at the knuckles, rough-surfaced, and ingrained with soil that had found its way into the grain of her skin and would not come out, not through any amount of washing. The palms were layered with calluses that had built up over weeks of pickaxe and shovel and wheelbarrow handles broken and reformed until they had achieved a density that felt like a different material entirely, like the hands of a woman who had been doing this kind of work all her life. She recognized these hands. She had seen them before at the end of her mother's wrists. She had held them, these hands, in the last weeks of her mother's life, had felt the roughness of the palm and the strength still resident in the grip even when the rest of her was failing. And before that, in the old country, stories her mother had told, the hands that appeared in all the accounts of Zophie were always described this way, as hands that knew what they were doing, hands that had earned their knowledge through the specific currency of sustained physical work. 3 generations of women who had stood in difficult places with tools in their hands and refused to be removed. She was not alone in this hole. She picked up the stone. She fitted it into the gap. It went in cleanly. She kept working. The roof was the problem she had been moving toward since she read the journal by candlelight, the thing she had known was coming and had no immediate solution to. The journal was clear about the necessity the glass surface needed to be substantial, well-sealed, correctly angled, and capable of withstanding significant wind and snow load. The angle was 45 degrees due south. The necessity of glass was not negotiable. You could not substitute oiled paper or animal membrane, both of which she had considered and abandoned. Glass transmitted a light in a way that nothing else she had access to could replicate, and light was the fuel that made the entire system work. She needed glass. She had almost no money. She had the forfeiture notice. She had her father's tools. She had, in a small velvet pouch at the bottom of the cedar-smelling trunk, the last material wealth her family had carried from the old country, 2 small gold earrings, and her mother's wedding band. She sat with the pouch in her hands for a long time. The earrings had been her grandmother's, passed to her mother at the wedding in the Carpathian village, where both of them had been born, worn on the occasions that merited them, and otherwise kept with the care given to things that were irreplaceable. The wedding band had gone into her mother's finger on the day she married and had never come off again, not once in the 23 years of the marriage, not through the winters and the hard work and the ocean crossing and the years on the claim. It had been removed by the women who prepared her mother's body for burial, and one of them had pressed it into Maren's right hand with a look that required no translation. She thought about what her mother would say. She thought she knew. She harnessed the thin cow to the small cart she had inherited, along with everything else, loaded it with the last vegetables she could spare, 6 dried beetroots and a handful of the salt pork, and set out before dawn. Aberdeen was 30 miles away. The journey took 2 days. She camped one night on the open prairie, wrapped in every blanket she had, the cow staked nearby, the cold working through the layers with patient thoroughness. She lay and looked at the stars over the Dakota Territory, enormous and pitiless and beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when their indifference to you was complete, and she thought about the journal in the cedar trunk and the hole in the ground and the 45-degree angle of a glass roof that did not yet exist. She arrived in Aberdeen in the late afternoon of the second day, cold and road-stiffened, the cow swaying with the weariness of 30 miles of heavy ground. The town was larger than she was accustomed to, a full main street with wooden storefronts and a railroad depot, and the particular energy of a place that believed itself to be on the way to somewhere rather than already there. She was an object of assessment the moment she turned onto the main street. A young woman alone with dirt under her nails and in the creases of her knuckles driving a cart behind a thin cow, her face set with the particular expression of someone who has decided on an outcome and is not available for conversation about alternatives. People looked. She did not look back. She sold the beets and the salt pork to the cook at the hotel for less than they were worth because she was in no position to negotiate from strength, and the cook knew it. She sold the cow at the livery stable for the same reason and received the same outcome, a price that reflected the buyer's assessment of her situation rather than the animal's actual value. The thin cow regarded her with its philosophical calm as she handed over the lead rope, and she stood for a moment with her hand on its nose and said something to it in the old language, a word of thanks or perhaps apology. Then she went to find August Real. He was not difficult to find. The mercantile his name was on was one of the larger establishments on the main street, its window displaying the kind of eclectic inventory that a frontier trading post accumulated over years of buying and selling whatever the territory needed and produced. She pushed open the door and heard the bell above it and stepped into the smell of flour and leather and lamp oil and the particular dry goods smell that was the same in every general store from here to the eastern seaboard. August Real was behind the counter, a man of perhaps 50, with the compact, deliberate manner of someone who had been measuring things by hand and eye for so long that he no longer needed tools to do it accurately. He looked up when she came in and saw what she was, which was not a mystery. He had been a merchant in a frontier town long enough to read the inventory of a person's situation in the way that she had learned to read the inventory of a soil horizon. She came to the counter. She had the velvet pouch in her coat pocket, and she could feel it against her palm through the wool, small and specific and heavy, in a way that had nothing to do with its actual weight. "I need glass," she said. She set the pouch on the counter. She did not explain. She did not say where she had come from, or what she was building, or what the glass was for. She had decided on the long, cold road from the claim to Aberdeen that she would not explain because explanation was a form of asking for understanding, and she did not need his understanding, only his inventory. Real looked at the pouch. He looked at it with the professional attention of a man who had handled exchanges of small valuables since the beginning of his career as a frontier merchant who could assess such things without making a production of the assessment. Then he looked at her face. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went through the door at the back of the store without speaking, and she heard the sounds of a storeroom being searched, things being moved and shifted, the particular sound of a man looking for something specific in a space organized by a logic other than the one he was currently applying. He was gone for several minutes. When he came back, he was carrying a stack of old window sashes, perhaps a dozen of them tied together with cord. Some of the panes were cracked. A few were missing entirely, their frames empty. Some were clouded with age and grime. They were salvage pulled from the ruins of a building that had burned, or perhaps several buildings, an opportunistic collection of whatever had been worth preserving from what could not be saved. He set them on the counter. "It's all I have," he said. Marin looked at the sashes. She looked at the condition of the glass, the cracks running through several panes, the empty frames, the clouding. She looked at the frames themselves, the lumber still structurally sound despite the damage the joints holding. "I'll take it," she said. She pushed the velvet pouch across the counter. He took it and did not open it in front of her. That was the entirety of the transaction. He helped her load the sashes into the cart with care, wrapping the more fragile ones in the old cloth she had brought for the purpose, positioning them so the weight of the stack held them stable rather than allowing them to shift and stress the cracked panes. She drove the 30 miles back alone, the cart heavier now, the sashes occupying the space where the cow had walked, and she drove with the careful deliberateness of a person transporting something irreplaceable. Every rut she navigated with conscious attention. Every slope she descended at reduced speed, feeling the load shift and compensating before the shift could become a problem. On the cold camp of the second night, she took out the velvet pouch and found that Real had returned it. He had kept what was inside and left the pouch itself, the faded velvet that had held her mother's earrings and her mother's ring through the ocean crossing and the years on the claim. She sat with the empty pouch in her hands for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket close to her chest next to the journal. The cold frame construction took 3 weeks. She worked from her father's lumber and her own salvage, the collapsed shed at the back of the property, yielding boards that were still sound beneath their weathered exterior. She built the north side of the roof, first the short, steep slope that would face into the prevailing winter wind, laying it with thick straw, and then the sod she had carefully saved from the initial excavation, each piece set grass side down over the straw, and then a final thick coat of the clay and grass mortar plastered smooth. It was ugly and it was effective, and effectiveness was the only measure she was applying. The south-facing slope was the precise work. The angle mattered. 45 degrees was not approximate. Sophie's journal had specified it as the result of decades of adjustment, the angle that captured the maximum possible solar energy from the sun's low winter arc across the southern sky at this latitude. Too steep and the sun hit the glass at a glancing angle that reduced transmission. Too shallow and the glass was angled toward a sky the winter sun rarely occupied. 45 degrees was the answer, and she measured it with the bevel square from her father's tools and checked the measurement 3 times before she began setting the framing. She fitted the window sashes into the frame with the careful attention of a person doing surgery, because the integrity of each joint was the integrity of the whole. Where panes were cracked, she pressed clay mortar carefully into the crack from both sides, working it until the seal was complete, and would she hoped hold against wind pressure. Where panes were missing entirely, she found pieces from other sashes that could be cut to fit using the glass cutter from her father's tools, a skill she had learned from watching him replace a broken pane in the cabin window. The autumn before the fever. She sealed every joint between the sashes and the framing with the clay and straw mixture, working it into each gap with her fingers until she felt the resistance that meant she had packed it tightly enough. She sealed the edges where the glass frame met the earthen walls of the excavation, where any gap would become a cold bridge drawing the outside temperature into the structure. It was ugly work. The finished roof looked nothing like the elegant diagrams in Sophie's journal, which had been drawn by someone with architectural drafting skills that Maren did not have. What she built was a patchwork, mismatched sashes in frames of salvaged lumber, the surfaces uneven, the lines imperfect, the clay ceiling visible in dark smears against the wood. It looked like what it was, something built from what was available by someone who was not a carpenter and did not have a carpenter's budget. But when she stood inside the excavation and looked up through the glass at the November sky, the light that came through was real and substantial, even from a sun so low in its arc that it barely cleared the southern horizon. She stood in the light that the glass was collecting and directing into the space below, and she raised her face to it, and it was warm on her skin, actually warm in a way that the November air outside was not. The thermal masswork was the final phase. She wrestled the 4 large wooden barrels from the lean-to into the excavation, a job that required a rope and a makeshift pulley system she rigged from a block she found in her father's tools, and a crossbeam she set over the top of the opening. Lowering each barrel into the space without breaking it, with no one to help manage the load, was the kind of problem that required her to become both the person controlling the rope and the person guiding the descent, moving back and forth between functions until each barrel sat on the floor of the excavation without damage. Then she filled them, bucket by bucket, from the well through the November cold that made the water sting her hands as she poured it. She carried water into the excavation and filled the barrels until each one was as full as she dared make it without risking overflow from freezing expansion. This was the thermal mass water, the slow warmth holder that would receive the sun's heat during the day and release it through the night. Sophie had written about watching the first winter, when the system was fully operational, watching the temperature inside hold above freezing, through nights when the outside temperature dropped to levels that froze the water in the creek solid in a matter of hours. She thought about those nights, and she filled the barrels. One afternoon near the end of the barrel-filling work, she heard footsteps at the edge of the excavation and looked up to find a woman she recognized as Mrs. Dorothea Crane, the land agent's mother. The old woman was something of a legend in the settlement, though a quieter legend than her son. She had been in the territory for 30 years and was one of the people who was occasionally pointed to as evidence that women could survive here, though the pointing was usually done by people who had not thought carefully about what that survival had cost. Maren had seen her at the edges of church gatherings and had noted without acting on the noting that she was one of the few people who had ever looked at the excavation project without the specific expression that everyone else brought to it. The old woman stood at the rim and looked down at the structure inside, at the stone walls and the water barrels and the raised planting beds that Marin had begun constructing along the sides, filling them with the rich topsoil she had saved and the compost from the pile her mother had maintained through the summer. Her face was a web of fine lines, the kind of face that came from decades of wind and sun and cold, and her eyes held something that Marin had not seen in any face since her parents died. Recognition. My grandmother, the old woman said. Her voice was raspy with age and the cold. In Denmark. She stopped. She looked at the structure again, at the angle of the roof and the stone walls and the barrels. She spoke of such things, she said. Earth, keeping warm in earth. She held out a bundle wrapped in cloth. A woman who works like that deserves more than scorn. Marin took the bundle. Inside was a small, round loaf of bread, dense and brown, still warm from the oven, releasing a smell so ordinary and so overwhelming that she felt something move through her chest that she was not prepared for. She had not tasted fresh bread in months. She had forgotten, in the long accumulation of difficulty, that bread was something that existed in the world. She felt the sting in her eyes and did not try to prevent it. Thank you, she said. The old woman nodded once, a slow and deliberate motion that carried more weight than most people put into a sentence. Then she looked at the sky, the same sky Marin had been reading for weeks, and her expression changed into something that was not worry exactly, but its more experienced cousin. Be careful, child, she said. A storm is coming. A bad one. I feel it in my bones. She turned and walked away, a small stooped figure growing smaller against the vast gray prairie sky, moving back toward the settlement with the care of someone who knew how to conserve motion. Marin stood in the opening of the excavation and held the warm loaf and watched her go. When the sound of her footsteps was gone, she climbed down the stairs into the structure and sat on the edge of one of the planting beds and ate the bread, slowly tasting each bite with the deliberate attention she gave to things she could not afford to waste. The planting beds she had built along the sides of the excavation were the last elements of the system that needed to be in place before the seeds went in. She had lined them with the flat stones from the creek bed, smaller than the wall stones, acting as a layer of thermal mass at the growing level to protect the root zone from any cold that might penetrate the soil surface during the most extreme nights. She had filled them with a mixture of the saved topsoil and the compost from her mother's pile and a quantity of the creek bottom silt that she had hauled in bucket loads, mineral-rich material that Sophie's journal identified as one of the best soil amendments for enclosed growing environments. She planned it on a Thursday in late November when the first real snow had dusted the prairie and the temperature outside had dropped into the range that made working above ground a battle of attention against the cold's persistent effort to narrow your focus to mere survival. Inside the excavation, with the glass roof panels in place and the system beginning to function, temperature was measurably different. She had hung a thermometer and instrument that had been her father's and that she had been carrying with her since the day she opened the journal and understood what it would measure. The morning of planting, the thermometer read 48 degrees Fahrenheit inside the structure. Outside, it was reading just above freezing, the kind of day that was cold, but not yet the thing that was coming. By afternoon, with the low November sun falling through the south-facing glass at its 45-degree angle, the temperature inside had climbed to 62. Marin sat back on her heels and looked at the thermometer for a long time. Then she took out the seed envelopes her mother had saved and labeled in her careful block letters through the summer. The cold, hardy varieties that Sophie's journal had identified as the best performers in enclosed growing conditions. The cutting lettuces and the spinach and the kale, the varieties of carrot and beet and turnip that grew their most important parts underground in the warm soil. A few precious envelopes of herbs, parsley and thyme and rosemary plants that asked for little and gave back more than they took. She planted them with the same attention she had given to everything else, basing them according to the journal's recommendations, pressing each seed to the correct depth in the prepared soil, firming the surface gently over each planted row. As she worked, she read the labels her mother had written on each envelope, the familiar handwriting and the familiar, careful block letters, and she understood that these were not just seeds. They were the last thing her mother's hands had touched with the intention of future growth, saved and labeled and set aside against a winter that Bozina Elwyn had not lived to see. She finished planting as the light through the glass was beginning to take on the lower angle of late afternoon. the sun moving toward the southwestern horizon, where it would disappear much too early. She stood in the middle of the structure and looked at the planted beds, the dark, rich soil with its faint corrugations from her fingers, the seeds invisible in it waiting. The temperature on the thermometer read 58 degrees. Outside through the glass, she could see the sky darkening in the northwest, with the specific darkness that meant weather. A darkness that was not the ordinary darkness of coming night, but something denser, something that had weight and intention in it. The clouds along that horizon were the color of an old bruise, the same color the sky had been on the morning Voss and Crane had come to assess the viability of her claim. She thought about what Mrs. Dorothea Crane had said. A storm is coming, a bad one. I feel it in my bones. She looked at the thermometer. She looked at the planted beds. She looked at the stone walls with their stored thermal mass and the water barrels with their stored thermal mass and the angled glass roof with its collected warmth. All of it working together the way Zophi had designed it to work, the interlocking system of physics and patience and understanding that kept the interior of this space above freezing, regardless of what the surface was doing. She climbed the stairs and stepped out into the cold and stood on the surface of the prairie and looked at the northwestern sky. The darkness on the horizon was not moving the way ordinary weather moved. It was not a storm system tracking across the sky from point to point in the way she had learned to read weather systems over years of watching this sky. It was expanding. It was growing from the northwest in all directions, simultaneously the kind of growth that meant something large and close was changing in ways that had consequences at this scale. She looked at the structure she had built, the patchwork glass roof barely visible under its light dusting of snow, the sod and straw of the north-facing side already blending with the white of the field around it. From above, from any distance at all, you would not be able to see it. It looked like a slight irregularity in the prairie surface, a natural feature, a swelling in the earth that was no different from 100 other swellings. That was the design. She went back inside and made her preparations for what was coming. She filled the lamp oil reservoir completely and set the spare tin where she could find it without light. She stacked the few remaining provisions on the shelf her father's tools had helped her build along the north wall. She checked the seals on the glass one final time, pressing the clay into any place where her fingers found even the faintest give, making the structure as tight as she could make it with what she had. Then she checked the thermometer one last time. 52 degrees with the last of the afternoon sun falling through the glass at its oblique winter angle. Outside, the temperature was dropping. The darkness in the northwest was closer now, and the air had taken on the particular stillness that came before certain kinds of weather. Stillness that was not peace, but the cessation of ordinary air movement in the face of something that was about to replace it with something else entirely. Marin stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at the rectangle of darkening sky visible through the glass panels. Her grandmother had spent 40 years building and refining this system in a mountain range that made the Dakota Prairie look mild by comparison. Her mother had spent years translating the record of those 40 years with the loving attention of a woman who understood that some knowledge was worth keeping alive across an ocean in a generation. The seeds were in the ground. The stone walls were charged with 2 weeks of autumn sunlight. The water barrels were full. The glass was sealed. She was 12 feet below the frost line in a structure that the coming storm would bury under several feet of snow, and the snow would be the finest insulation. She had the weight of it pressing down on the sod roof and the straw and the earth, sealing out the wind and holding in the warmth that the stone and the water and the deep earth were about to spend the night producing. The darkness reached the edge of the sky above the glass. The stillness broke, and the world above the surface of the Dakota Territory began its transformation into something that would be given a name before it was finished. The change came between one breath and the next. Not gradually, not with the warnings that reasonable weather provided, the darkening sky and the rising wind and the incremental dropping of temperature that gave a person time to understand what was approaching and prepare some response to it. There was the strange warm morning of January 12th, the yellow-gray sky that Marin had been watching since before dawn with the attention of someone who understood that the most dangerous deceptions were the comfortable ones. And then there was the wall. It came out of the northwest as a solid mass, not weather, but a replacement for weather, not wind, but the abolition of the air that had existed before it arrived. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in the time it took a person to turn from a window and call out to the children to come inside. The ice crystals it carried were not snow. They were something finer and more violent than snow particles of frozen water, so numerous and so fast-moving that they constituted a medium rather than a precipitation, a horizontal blindness that erased the world between one heartbeat and the next. This was the day that would be given a name. In the settlement, the deceptive warmth of the morning had done exactly what deceptive warmth was designed to do. Children had walked to the schoolhouse in light coats because the temperature had suggested light coats were appropriate. Men had gone out to check their livestock and their trap lines because the mild air had invited exactly that kind of careless confidence. Stellan Voss had stood on the porch of his house that morning, the house he had built with his own hands and his own considerable skill and his absolute certainty about what constituted sound construction in this territory, and he had looked out at the yellow-gray sky and declared the back of winter broken. He had said it with the authority of a man who had been saying things with authority for long enough that the saying and the believing had become indistinguishable from each other. He had said it to his wife who was hanging washing in the thin warmth. He had said it to his oldest boy who was splitting wood with the half-hearted energy of someone who had been told to split wood and was splitting enough of it to satisfy the letter of the instruction. He had said it loud enough that the neighbors who might have been within earshot could hear it because pronouncements of this kind derive part of their authority from having witnesses. Then the wall arrived. The washing was gone in seconds, taken by a wind that had no interest in the domestic arrangements of the people living in its path. The temperature collapsed. The yellow-gray sky became a white chaos so complete and so immediate that Voss's wife, who was 40 feet from the porch when it hit, had to find her way back by following the sound of her husband's voice. He stood at the door of the house he had built and watched the storm replace the world with itself, and he felt the specific chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, the chill of a man who has just realized that the thing he was wrong about was more serious than the things he was usually wrong about. He went inside and stoked the stove. The stove was the best iron stove available in the territory. He had sold dozens of them to the settlers whose cabins he had also built, and he had believed in both the cabins and the stoves with the faith of a man who had put his name on them. The stove produced heat with the ravenous efficiency of a thing that had been designed to do exactly this. It consumed wood at a rate that initially seemed fine, then concerning, then alarming. By the end of the first day, a cord of wood that should have lasted a week was reduced to less than half. The heat the stove produced went where heat went in a thin-walled structure, up the chimney and through the walls and into the shrieking white, nothing outside where the storm processed it, the same way it processed everything indifferently. The corners of the main room showed frost at the junction of wall and floor, a development that Voss looked at with the expression of a man encountering information that contradicts everything he has staked his reputation on. His wife moved the children to the main room. She wrapped them in everything available. She kept the stove burning because the alternative to the stove was not a temperature she was prepared to contemplate. Emmett was 8 years old, Voss's youngest, a boy with his mother's eyes and his father's habit of watching the world with a directness that sometimes made adults uncomfortable. He had been outside when the storm arrived, playing in the brief warmth of the morning, and he had breathed whatever the storm carried in its first minutes before anyone could get him inside. His cough began that evening. It was a reasonable cough at first, the cough of a child who had breathed cold air and whose body was registering this fact. By the second day, it was something else. It had acquired a depth and a roughness that came from lower in the chest than a surface cough came from, and it had the persistent quality of something that was not going to clear on its own with rest and warmth. There was not enough warmth. The second day of the storm was the day the reality of the structure became undeniable. The wood supply that Voss had accumulated with such satisfaction through the autumn was burning at a rate that could not be sustained. The chinking he had applied between the logs with such expertise was admitting cold at every gap the wind found, and the wind found all of them, because the wind at 60 miles an hour carrying ice crystals that could work their way through a gap a human finger could not have identified was more systematic in its search than any inspector he had ever seen. He sat in the corner nearest the stove, and he listened to Emmett cough, and he thought about what he knew and what it had cost him to know it and what it was costing him now. He thought about the whole. The thought came from somewhere he had not expected it to come from the place where the mind went when it had exhausted the available inventory of reasonable options and was beginning to consider the inventory of unreasonable ones. The thought was not hope. Hope required some foundation and plausible outcome. The thought was more primitive than hope. It was the last flicker of a father's refusal to stop the animal insistence of a creature whose children were in danger, that there must be something left to try on. She is dead, he told himself. Any sensible assessment of the situation produced this conclusion. She was a girl of 19 with no experience and inadequate resources, who had spent the autumn digging a hole in the ground that he had named her grave. The storm had been killing people who were better prepared than she had been. She was dead, and the hole was a hole, and he was a dying man looking for a reason to die somewhere else. But the thought persisted. He had watched her work for 3 months. He had ridden by every few days to observe the latest development in what he had characterized as folly, and what he had seen, whatever he had called it, was a 19-year-old girl working with a systematic intensity that he recognized because he had spent his adult life in proximity to people who built things. He had told himself that the work was pointless. He had not told himself it was undisciplined because it was not undisciplined. He had not told himself she did not know what she was doing because the evidence of the doing suggested otherwise. He had attributed the methodology to stubbornness, and the stubbornness to grief, and grief to the ordinary category of emotions that made rational people irrational, and he had ridden away satisfied with this assessment. Now Emmett coughed, and the woodpile was 2 days from gone, and the frost in the corners of the main room was not getting smaller, and the assessment he had been satisfied with was not available to him in the same way anymore. He began to dress. His wife watched him from across the room with the eyes of a woman who understood what her husband was doing and knew that telling him not to do it would accomplish nothing except costing them the last exchange they might have before he went. "Be careful," she said. He could not tell her he would be careful. Careful was not a condition that applied to what he was about to do. He wrapped himself in every layer he had, wrapping his face until only his eyes were exposed, and he tied a length of rope around his waist and knotted the other end to the porch railing. He paid it out behind him as he went, because without a fixed line back to the porch railing of the house he had built, there would be no finding the house again, and he knew this with the precision of a man who understood structures and the spaces between them. He stepped off the porch and the world took him. There was no up, there was no down, there was no direction that presented itself as a reliable guide to the location of anything. There was only the horizontal white chaos that the storm had made of the air, and the cold that was not cold in any ordinary sense, but a physical pressure that sought entry at every boundary between his layers and his skin, and the wind that was not wind in any ordinary sense, but a sustained mechanical force that had been operating at this level for 2 days and showed no indication of being done. He crawled. He crawled on his hands and knees along what he believed to be the track road, feeling for the slight difference in surface between the packed earth of the road and the grass on either side, a difference he could barely register through the thickness of his gloves and his boots. He stopped every few feet and turned his back to the wind and breathed, because breathing against the wind directly meant not breathing. He counted his rope as it paid out behind him. He was not driven by hope. He was driven by something older and simpler than hope, something that did not require a plausible outcome, something that was simply the refusal of a father who still had rope left to continue until the rope was gone. It took him the better part of 2 hours to cover the distance he could have walked in 15 minutes on any other day. His hands and face had passed through the ordinary stages of cold, and now at the other side into the territory where sensation was becoming intermittent, where his mind was supplying sensory information based on memory rather than actual feeling. He was sobbing without being aware of sobbing, his face a frozen mask of everything that had been accumulating since he had stood on his porch and declared the back of winter broken. He was not going to find anything. He was going to find a snow-covered hole in the ground with a dead girl in it, and then he was going to be in the storm without enough rope to get back, and that was going to be the end of it. And the last thing Stellenbosch would have done with his life was crawl through a blizzard to be proven right about something he wished he had been wrong about. He crawled through what he believed to be the approximate location of the Elwyn claim and found nothing, and kept crawling and found nothing, and then his hands found something that was not nothing. A rise in the earth, slight but real, a shape under the snow that was not the shape the prairie made when it was covered in snow, not the smooth and featureless blanket that the storm had applied to the flat ground. Something with geometry in it, something with intention. He stopped. He pressed his hands against it and felt the slight resistance of packed snow over something that was not earth, not the yielding packed solid earth of the prairie in January. He moved along it, following the contour with his numbed hands, and the contour was not random. It had a slope to it, a deliberate, specific slope, 45 degrees. He knew that angle. He had been a builder for 30 years. He could feel the angle of a surface with his hands the way a musician felt the pitch of a note, not as a measurement, but as a quality, an immediate and precise recognition. 45 degrees. The same angle he had seen on the south-facing slope of the patchwork glass roof for 3 months, and dismissed as the angle of a roof built by someone who did not know what they were doing. He scraped at the snow. His hands were not reliable instruments at this point, but they could scrape, and he scraped at the surface until he found what was underneath the snow, and what was underneath the snow was glass. Old, uneven, salvaged glass set in frames of rough lumber, mortared with clay that had dried and held. He pressed his face against it. He cupped his hands around his eyes to block the white chaos, and he pressed his face against the glass, and he looked down through it, and the world he saw on the other side of the glass was so far outside any category of experience available to him that his mind simply refused it for a moment, and then presented it again with the same result. Green. Rows of green, not the memory of green, not a description of green, but actual living green, the green of lettuce and spinach and kale at the stage of full growth, crisp and present and unreasonably, impossibly, defiantly alive, in the middle of the worst blizzard that the Dakota Territory had ever produced. The dark soil of the planting beds was damp. The stone walls of the structure glistened with moisture in the lamplight. The water in the barrels along the back wall had a faint surface movement to it, not quite steam, but close the visual signature of water that is meaningfully warmer than the air above it. And in the center of it all, on her knees beside the nearest planting bed, was Maren Elwyn. She was wearing a wool dress and a light shawl. Her hair was pulled back with the practical inattention of someone who had arranged their hair for working purposes and not for any other. Beside her was a small basket. In her hand was a small knife. She was cutting the outer leaves from a head of lettuce with the calm, methodical attention of a person doing a familiar task in a comfortable environment on an ordinary afternoon. She was not surviving. She was not enduring. She was not waiting out the crisis or hoping for rescue or calculating how long her resources would hold. She was doing what she did every day in this space, tending the plants that her grandmother had designed and her mother had preserved, and she had built in the same way and with the same attention, regardless of what the world above the glass was doing. The contrast between the two sides of the glass was not a contrast that language was adequate to. On one side, the howling destruction of the worst storm in living memory, a temperature that was actively killing people in structures that the settlement's most experienced builder had declared sound. On the other side, a woman in a shawl cutting lettuce. Voss hit the glass with his fist. He did not decide to hit the glass. The decision was not involved. His fist hit the glass because his fist had run out of other responses to what his eyes were reporting, because the part of him responsible for responses had received information it could not process in any other way, because 40 degrees of temperature drop in 4 minutes, in 2 hours of crawling through a blizzard, and the sound of Emmett's cough rattling shallower in his chest had stripped away everything that normally stood between the raw animal self and the glass. The sound was faint. The wind overhead absorbed it almost entirely. But the silence inside the structure was complete, and faint sounds in complete silence were audible. Maren looked up. She looked up with the expression of someone who has heard something unexpected in a space where unexpected sounds had consequences, alert and attentive, without the overlay of fear that would have been reasonable given her circumstances. She saw the dark shape of a face pressed against the glass above her, obscured by ice and shadow and the distortion of the old glass, and for a moment she was still. Then she was moving. She set down the knife. She rose from her knees. She disappeared from the portion of the space visible through the glass. A moment later, he felt the vibration of something moving along the structure's surface, and then the insulated door at the top of the stairs was opening, pushing outward against the weight of snow that had accumulated against it, and the opening was there. Warmth came out of it. Not a blaze of warmth, not the aggressive radiated heat of a fire at full burn. A stable living warmth, the warmth of a space that had been maintained at a consistent temperature through the application of physics and patience. and 40 years of accumulated understanding. The warmth of stone walls that had been absorbing sunlight for 2 months. The warmth of water barrels that remembered 2 months of Dakota winter days. The warmth of the earth at 12 feet of depth, the warmth that the frost line had never reached and never would reach. He went through the opening. He did not navigate the stairs with any dignity. He fell through the opening and went down the stairs sideways and landed at the bottom in a configuration that bore no relationship to intentional movement. He lay on the earthen floor, and the warmth of the structure moved over him like something that had been waiting to do this. He tore the ice-caked scarves from his face. He pulled the frozen gloves from his hands. He pressed his bare palms against the earthen floor and felt the temperature of it, the specific not cold of earth below the frost line, cool but not freezing, the steady patient warmth that had been there all along, that he had dismissed as folklore and ignorance. Marin stood over him. He looked up at her face in the lamplight, and what he saw there was not what he had earned, and perhaps not what he deserved. There was no satisfaction in it, no vindication, none of the expressions that the situation might have licensed that would have been completely understandable, given the preceding 3 months of mockery and dismissal, and the forfeiture notice and the $20 offer for her father's tools. There was only a clear-eyed, unsentimental compassion. The compassion not of someone who did not understand what had been done to them, but of someone who had decided that what had been done to them was not the most important thing present in this moment. She knelt beside him. She put a tin cup into his hands and closed his hands around it. The cup contained liquid that was hot, actually hot, steaming in the lamplight, and the heat of it moved through his palms and into the frozen core of him with the specific and unrepeatable quality of warmth that arrives at the exact moment when the absence of warmth had become the total fact of existence. He drank it, mint and rosemary. The herbs she had grown from the seeds her mother had saved and labeled in careful block letters, the herbs her mother had known she would need. He looked at the stone walls. He looked at the water barrels. He looked at the rows of green in the planting beds, the lettuce and spinach and kale that were growing at the bottom of the worst blizzard in Dakota history, because someone had understood what he had dismissed and had built what he had called a grave. He was a builder. He had been a builder for 30 years. He looked at what she had built, and he understood it with the specific comprehension of someone who knew how things were made, who could read a structure the way other people read a text, following the logic of each decision back to the understanding that had produced it. The depth of the excavation, the stone walls lined against the earthen sides, the water barrels positioned to receive maximum solar gain through the glass panels. The angle of the glass roof, 45 degrees, precisely the angle that maximized reception of the winter sun's low arc across the southern sky. Every element of it was a decision arrived at through understanding, through the accumulated knowledge of someone who had spent 40 years paying attention to what the earth was willing to give. He had stood at the edge of this excavation and called it folly. How he said. The word came out as the voice of a man whose throat had been raw with cold for 2 days, and who was discovering that the difficulty was not entirely physical. How is this possible? Marin gestured at the walls, at the roof, at the earth around them. The earth is warm, she said. She said it with the simplicity of someone stating a fact that had never required argument because it had been true for 100 years before she said it and would be true for 100 years after. The sun gives its heat, she said. The stones and the water remember it. She picked up a handful of soil from the planting bed beside her. It crumbled in her fingers the way rich living soil crumbled, dark and dense and complex with the organisms that made growth possible. This is not a grave, she said. She looked at him. It never was. He began to weep. He did not try to prevent the weeping, and the weeping did not ask his permission. It came from the same place the fist had come from below the level where decisions were made, from the place that had been accumulating what the preceding months had produced and had run out of other ways to express it. He wept for Emmett's cough and for his wife's face and for the frost in the corners of the room he had declared well-built. He wept for the 40 years of certainty that had brought him and his community to this place. He wept for the $20 offer, and for the words he had called down into the excavation, and for the name the children had given to this space in which he was now sitting alive because of the woman he had sentenced with that name. "My son," he said. His voice was barely a voice. "Emmett, he's sick. We have no more wood, no food. He looked at her with the face of a man who has nothing left to offer and knows it. Everyone is dying. Marin was already moving. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said more clearly than words could manage. She moved through the planting beds with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she had and exactly what it could do. She cut the outer leaves from the lettuce, taking what could be taken without damaging the plant's ability to continue producing. She pulled carrots from the warm soil, small and perfect, their orange, a visual fact so ordinary and so extraordinary in this context that it required a moment to absorb. She pulled beets, their skins smooth and firm. She filled the basket her mother had brought from the Carpathian Highlands, and she filled a second one with the systematic thoroughness of someone who was not giving charity, but solving a problem with the resources available. She added dried herbs from the rack along the north wall. Rosemary, thyme, parsley. "This will make a broth," she said. Her voice was practical and direct, the voice of someone giving instructions that needed to be followed correctly. "The rosemary is good for a cough. The warmth will help him more than anything else." He stared at the baskets. He had offered her $20 for her father's tools. He had ridden by every few days to observe her work and contribute his verdict from horseback. He had brought his son to watch and learn the shape of failure. He had said, "Don't come begging when the first blizzard hits." He had said, "A community can't carry the dead weight of the unprepared." She was giving him 2 baskets of vegetables and a remedy for his sick son. Shame was a physical sensation. It sat in his chest and pressed outward against his ribs from the inside, and it had no exit. She bundled herself in her father's coat and her wool hat and her mittens with the same efficiency she brought to everything. She took the second coil of rope from the peg on the wall, and she tied one basket to her own back with a length of cord and handed him the other. "Stay behind me," she said. "Keep hold of the rope. Don't stop moving, no matter what you feel." She looked at him with the directness she had been looking at the world with since the morning he had ridden down the slope to tell her what her life was worth. "Can you stand?" He stood. They went out. The wind hit them both, and she absorbed it the way she had absorbed everything else, by understanding it rather than fighting it. She moved low to the ground, reading the surface with her feet finding the track road by the memory of a path she had walked in every kind of weather for months. She had learned the hollow of this particular stretch of terrain, the way she had learned the angle of the winter sun, not as a measurement, but as a knowledge that lived in the body, immediate and automatic. He followed her. It was the most accurate description of the relationship between them now and going forward. She moved and he followed. She knew and he learned. She had built the thing he had called impossible, and the thing he had called impossible had just kept him alive. And the knowledge of how to build it had come from a woman who had spent 40 years in a mountain range that would have ended his certainty in the first season. He followed her through the white chaos of the worst storm in the territory's history, a small, determined figure ahead of him, with 2 baskets of vegetables and a rope leading him back toward the house he had built that was killing his family. When they came through the door of the Voss house, his wife's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, each one superseded by the next before it could complete itself: shock and relief, and the particular quality of a face confronting something that exceeds the emotional categories available to it. The vegetables were the last thing she expected. The crisp green leaves of the lettuce, the firm orange of the carrots, the deep red of the beets. These colors had no business being present in January, in a house where the corner frost had been spreading since the first night of the storm, and they were present, and she could not stop looking at them. Marin was at the dead stove before anyone asked her to be, working with the competence of someone who had been coaxing fire in difficult conditions all winter. She had the last remnants of the broken chair burning within minutes. She put water on. She began the broth. She went to Emmett first. She knelt beside the boy, and she put her hand on his forehead, and she spoke to him quietly in a tone that contained no alarm, because alarm was not useful to a sick child, and she knew what was useful and what was not. She looked at Voss over the boy's head, and her expression told him what he needed to know, which was that this was recoverable, that the warmth and the broth and the rosemary would do what they were designed to do, that the outcome was not already written. Emmett drank the broth. The color change was slow, and it was real. Not dramatic, not the instant transformation of a folk remedy in a story. The slow incremental recovery of a body that had been losing ground and had been given what it needed to stop losing ground and begin the other direction. Voss watched his son drink the broth that the girl he had sentenced to death had grown in a hole he had named her grave, and he sat with all of this in the particular silence of a man who is not going to look away from what he has done, because looking away is what he had been doing, and the results were in. They went to the Crane house next. Aldous Crane opened the door and looked at Marin with the expression of a man whose system for categorizing the world had produced results that the categories could not contain. He was cold. His mother was behind him, wrapped in every layer of clothing she owned, and the old woman looked at Marin and at the basket and at the cold, purposeful face of the 19-year-old girl she had brought bread to in November. The girl she had watched all summer and all autumn, and in whom she had recognized something that her Danish grandmother had told her about in a voice that held the same quality as the journal, the quality of knowledge that was older than the people transmitting it. Dorothea Crane nodded. It was the same nod she had given in November, the nod that confirmed what she had already known before confirmation was required. There was no surprise in it. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a faith that had been tested and had held a satisfaction that was not vindication, but simply the settling of a thing that had been uncertain into the category of things that were certain. Aldous Crane, the man of paper and authority, the man who had delivered the forfeiturer's notice, with the practiced cadence of a system explaining itself, looked at the basket of vegetables in the worst storm in the territory's history and had nothing to say that was adequate to what he was looking at. He helped carry his mother through the blizzard. They descended the stairs into the Elwyn structure, the Crane family and the Voss family, and the third family Marin had led through the storm by rope, and they filled the corners of the space that had been built for growing things and found that it held them. The stone walls held their warmth. The temperature held at 49 degrees. The oil lamp burned with the steady patience of a flame that had adequate fuel and adequate air and no reason to hurry. Above them, the storm screamed at a register that had nothing left to escalate to. Below the glass in the lamplight, among the rows of green that had no business being alive, and were alive anyway, the families of the Dakota Territory settlement that had named this place a grave sat in the warmth of the earth and listened to the storm fail to reach them. Emmett fell asleep against his mother's side with the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a body that has been given what it needed and is responding with the straightforwardness of things that are not complicated. His cough was quieter. His color was better. Marin moved through the space, checking the planting beds, adjusting the wick of the lamp, doing the ordinary work of tending the structure, because the structure required tending regardless of how many people were sitting in its corners, because the work did not stop being the work, because the context had changed. Dorothea Crane watched her. The old woman's eyes moved from the stone walls to the water barrels to the glass roof buried under the blizzard's accumulation, taking in the elements of the system, with the recognition of someone whose grandmother had described a system very much like this one in a farmhouse in Denmark in the language of women who knew things that the men around them had not thought to learn. "You understand it?" Marin said. It was not a question. "My grandmother built something similar," the old woman said. "In Denmark. She said the earth was a friend if you knew how to ask it." Marin looked at her. "That is exactly what my grandmother said," she said. The storm held for 4 days. On the fourth day, it broke with the same abruptness with which it had arrived, the wind ceasing between 1 hour and the next, and the silence that replaced it being so complete, after 4 days of continuous roar, that several people woke from sleep because the absence of sound was louder than the sound had been. They came up the stairs into a world that had been remade. The prairie was gone. In its place was a succession of drifts so large and so geometrically various that the landscape the settlement had occupied was only inferable present as an idea beneath a surface that had been freshly imposed over it. The settlement's cabins were mounds. Several had sustained structural damage that was visible even under the snow. The shallow root cellars were total losses, their contents frozen solid, the winter food supply of an entire community converted to ice by a temperature that the 3 and 4 feet of those cellars had never been designed to resist. The accounting was long and sobering and would take weeks to complete. Marin stood on the surface above her structure and looked at the settlement and felt the particular quality of a morning after the clarity of a world that has been through something and is being seen for what it actually is, rather than what it had been assumed to be. She felt tired in the way of someone who had been working towards something for months and had arrived at the place the work had been aimed at and was not sure yet what to do with the arrival. She went back inside and checked the thermometer. 51 degrees. The thermal mass had held through 4 days of the worst blizzard in the territory's recorded history. The planting beds were undamaged. The seedlings were exactly as they had been before the storm, because the storm had not reached them, because the design had worked, because 40 years of careful observation in the Carpathian Highlands had produced a system that the Dakota Territory winter could not defeat. She harvested the morning's lettuce. A week after the storm broke, they came. Not two of them this time. Not the careful pair of assessors with their clipboard and their condescension. A procession, 8 men, 10 more, moving along the track road toward the Elwyn claim, with their hats in their hands, in the specific posture of people who are coming to say something that has cost them something to arrive at. Stellan Voss was at the front. He was not the same man who had sat his horse on the rise above the claim in September and pronounced the verdict. The storm had taken something from him that the cold had only started. The arrogance was gone in the way that things went gone when the evidence against them was too comprehensive and too recent to be argued with. What was left was a man, which was not a small thing, but it was a different thing from what had been there before. Aldous Crane was beside him. He was carrying paper. Not the clipboard, not the form with the line near the bottom and the decisive pen mark that had sounded like a verdict being recorded. He was carrying a single sheet of paper that was different from all the paper he had carried before, and when Marin came to meet them at the edge of the claim, he held it out, and she took it, and she read it. It was the deed to 160 acres in the name of Marin Elwyn, free and clear, signed and witnessed and recorded in the county land office, in terms that left nothing subject to review. Crane reached into his coat pocket and produced another piece of paper. He looked at it for a moment, and then he tore it. He tore it carefully, deliberately into pieces small enough that they could be trusted to the wind, and he released them, and the wind of the January morning took them and distributed them across the white prairie, and they were gone. "The land is yours," he said. His voice had lost the rehearsed cadence of the official performing an official function. It was only a man's voice now. He cleared his throat. "My mother, she said from the beginning that you were a woman of substance. I'm sorry it took me this long to understand what she meant." He stepped back. Voss stepped forward. He had been thinking for a week about what to say, and what he had arrived at was not a speech. It was shorter than a speech. It was the kind of thing that was shorter than a speech, precisely because it was more expensive, because the words that cost the most were not the many, but the few, because what could be said with many words could be said with fewer honest ones. And there was a point at which adding more words was a way of diluting the honest ones with the comfortable ones. "We were wrong," he said. He said it the way it needed to be said, without qualification and without the renegotiation that qualifications performed, without the but that would have transferred part of the accounting to circumstances or bad luck, or the inherent difficulty of predicting winter in a new territory. "We were wrong, and our wrongness nearly killed us, and you saved us anyway." He looked at her. "We don't come for charity," he said. "We have nothing to offer you that approaches what you've given us. We come to ask." He gestured at the men behind him, settlements men, the builders and the farmers, and the men who had stood at the edge of the excavation and laughed at the girl digging in the wrong direction. "Teach us," he said. "Teach us what you know. Teach us what your grandmother knew. We will build what you tell us to build. We will dig where you tell us to dig." He paused. "We will listen." Marin looked at the faces of the men who had come. She looked at each face long enough to see it, the fear and the humility, and underneath both of those, the thing that was more valuable than either the particular quality of people who had been certain about the wrong things and had survived being wrong about them and had arrived on the other side of that survival changed. She went into the structure. She came back with the journal. The leather cover was dark with the handling of 3 generations of women, cracked in the pattern of something that had been used rather than preserved, its embossed, swirling design worn smooth at the places that hands most naturally held it. It had crossed an ocean. It had survived a fever and a forfeiture notice, and a blizzard that had been given a name, and it was here in her hands in the Dakota Territory in January 1888, exactly where her grandmother's 40 years of work had been aimed. "The knowledge is not mine alone," she said. She held the journal out toward them. "It belongs to anyone with the will to listen to the earth. That summer, the settlement did not build cabins. Under Marin's guidance, working from the journal and from her own first season of operation, and from the questions that the men brought with the earnest curiosity of people who have had their previous certainties cleared away and are starting again from the foundation, they excavated 3 new structures. Voss brought his builder's skill to the framing of the angled roofs and the precise setting of the glass to the drainage and ventilation problems that the journal addressed and that required adaptation to the specific conditions of the Dakota terrain. He was a different builder now. He asked questions before he made pronouncements. He looked at what the earth was doing before he decided what to build on top of it. He brought his skill to serve the knowledge rather than to replace it, and the structures he helped build that summer were better than anything he had built before, not because his skill was greater, but because it was no longer working against the thing it was supposed to serve. The structures were not called follies. They were not called graves. They were called Elwins, not by any formal decision, not by any ceremony or proclamation, by the natural process through which names attach themselves to things, when the things themselves made the naming inevitable, when the connection between a name and an object had been established by events too significant to be absorbed without a name for the referent. Marin lived her whole life on the claim. She never married because the life she had did not require a different shape, because the community she had saved and that had built itself around her was a kind of family that did not require the formal arrangements of family, because she was 19 years old in 1887, and she was old in the last decade of the century. And in between those two facts, she grew more food than she could count, and taught more people than she could name, and built more knowledge into the soil of the Dakota Territory than anyone who had preceded her. The winters after 1888 were different winters. Not easier because the Dakota winter was not a thing that became easy, but different in what they meant to the people who lived through them. When the blizzards came, and they came, every year the families of the settlement had the Elwins, and the Elwins held their warmth, and the food that grew in the planting beds was there in January when nothing else was, and the children who ate it were not the pale and hollow-eyed children who had stood at the edge of the excavation and whispered the girl's grave. They were the children who grew knowing that the earth was warm if you knew how to ask it. Marin taught them, not as a teacher standing at the front of a room, but as a person working, inviting the curious to work alongside her, answering the questions that work generated with the specificity of someone who had learned from doing and knew how to transmit that kind of learning. She taught from the journal and from her own additions to it, the decade-by-decade accumulation of observations and adjustments and refinements that continued the conversation Zophi had begun and that Bozina had preserved. She grew old in the way that people grew old when their work was their life and their life was their work, when there was no distinction between the self and the thing the self was doing that would have allowed aging to register as loss. Her hands became what Zophi's hands had been, in the stories gnarled and soil-ingrained, and capable in the specific way of hands that had been doing one thing for a long time and had become the instrument of that thing rather than the tool. On a September evening in the last decade of the century, she sat at the edge of the original Elwyn, the structure she had built from salvaged glass and creek stones, and her mother's compost and her grandmother's 40 years of understanding. The settlement around her had become a town. The town had the Elwyns at its center the way some towns had a church or a courthouse as the thing around which the rest of the life of the place organized itself. A child came to her. 8 years old, the granddaughter of a man who had stood at the edge of the excavation in 1887 and confirmed the verdict. The girl had soil on her hands from the planting bed she had been working in, and her eyes had the quality that Marin had been watching for and finding in the children of the settlement. For years, the quality of someone who was paying attention to the right things. She sat beside Marin and looked at the low September sun moving through its arc. "Why does the glass have to be that angle?" she asked. It was the question Marin had been waiting for. Not because she had not answered it many times before, but because this particular girl asking it now meant the question was going to travel forward again, was going to be carried by this girl into her own life and her own winters and eventually into the lives of the children she would teach the way. The question had traveled from the Carpathian Highlands across an ocean and a generation to arrive in the hands of a 19-year-old girl with a forfeiture notice and a pickaxe and a hole that was not deep enough. Because the sun is lower in winter, Marin said, and the glass has to face it directly to receive what it has to give. The girl thought about this with the focused silence of someone doing actual thinking. How did you know that, she asked? My grandmother knew it, Marin said. And my mother remembered it, and I built it. The girl looked at the glass roof, catching the September light at its precise and deliberate angle. Can I learn it, she asked. Marin looked at her. It is the kind of knowledge, she said, that only grows if you give it away. She stood up. She held out her hand and the girl took it, and they walked together toward the entrance of the structure, toward the stairs that led down into the warmth that the earth had always been keeping, toward the planting beds and the stone walls and the water barrels and the light that the glass was sending where light had no business going. Below the frost line, the earth maintained its constant temperature, as it had always done, as it would continue to do long after the names of the people who had learned to ask it correctly had been absorbed into the land itself, and the land had continued without them, patient and warm and full of everything that was waiting to be grown by anyone who had the will to dig.